Hi guys. Tonight I'd like to take you far back into a world that never truly sleeps. This is the story of how medieval people drifted into dreams, of the odd and fascinating ways they rested, woke and drifted again into slumber. It is not just about sleep, but about the quiet shadows of the night in a time before street lamps, before alarm clocks, and before the hum of machines. We will wander through candlelit chambers, down winding staircases, into the warmth of straw-stuffed beds and cold stone floors. You will meet peasants and kings, monks and maidens, and together we will listen for the soft breathing of a world long past. Over the course of these nights together, we will uncover the strange habits and whispered beliefs that shaped medieval sleep. When the darkness felt thicker, dreams were seen as omens, and sleep came in two distinct acts. So, let us begin slowly, as the evening bells fade and the hearth's last ember glows. In a village tucked deep into the folds of a valley, where the river's voice could be heard even from the farthest thatched roof, the hour was well past sunset. The day's labours had ended, but the people were not yet entirely lost to rest. Inside the low wooden cottages, the air smelled faintly of smoke and sheep's wool. Families gathered close to the fire, not merely for warmth, but because night was not something to be taken lightly. There was a quiet vigilance about the medieval night. Without moonlight, the dark seemed to hold its own pulse, and the shadows beyond the doorway felt watchful. Sleep in this world was not simply the shutting of eyes. It was a surrender, and surrenders were best prepared for. A bed for most was not the grand four-poster of romance tales. It was a rough wooden frame, or no frame at all, just a heap of straw, covered with coarse linen if fortune allowed. The straw was changed only a few times a year, and in winter it might be topped with extra layers. An old cloak, a tattered blanket, even spare sacks. Sleeping alone was rare. Families, especially in the colder months, would lie close together for warmth, children nestled against parents, siblings sharing the same blanket. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even then servants might sleep on the floor nearby. The human closeness, the shared breathing, became part of the texture of the night. But medieval people did not expect to sleep the whole way through until morning. Their nights were often divided into two distinct sleeps. The first sleep began not long after nightfall, sometimes as early as 8 in the evening. It was deep and heavy, carrying them into a world of dreams where saints or demons might appear. Then, somewhere past midnight, many would wake. Naturally, without any prompting. This was not a restless, frustrated awakening, but a quiet interlude known in some places as the watch or the waking. People used this time in many ways, to tend to the fire, to whisper prayers, to reflect on dreams, or even to slip outdoors for a moment under the stars. Inside monasteries, this midnight waking had a holy rhythm. Bells would toll through the sleeping cloisters, calling monks to rise for matins, the night prayers. The stone floors beneath their bare feet were cold, the chapel's air colder still, but they moved through the silence with a kind of patient devotion. After prayers, some might return to their beds for the second sleep, while others stayed awake, reading by the flicker of a candle or tending to small tasks. In the homes of the common folk, the watch could be a time for hushed conversation between spouses, a few stolen pages read by those rare enough to own a book, or quiet handiwork that didn't need daylight. Some would take advantage of the stillness to check on livestock, ensuring that no fox had slipped into the chicken coop. The world outside was not entirely sleeping either. In towns, night watchmen paced the streets, lanterns swinging, calling out the hour in low voices. The second sleep, beginning in the deepest part of the night, was softer and often filled with vivid dreams. It was during this time, people believed, that visions were more likely to be prophetic. A dream of running water, of certain animals, or of a particular person could be discussed the next day with great seriousness. Sleep, to the medieval mind, was not simply rest. It was a threshold between the known and the mysterious. Not all could afford this rhythm. In taverns and alehouses, the hum of voices might last into the early hours. Travellers arriving late would knock on indoors, seeking a bed or a space on the floor. Some poor souls, without a roof at all, sought shelter under the eaves of barns or beside the warmth of kitchen ash. Even then, they might find rest in short, broken spells, ears pricked for danger. For the wealthy, however, night could be an indulgence. In the upper chambers of a manor, thick curtains hung around great beds, not only to keep in heat, but to keep out the draughts that wandered through the stone halls. Soft feather mattresses, imported blankets, and even heated stones wrapped in cloth could make the winter night more comfortable. Servants might enter quietly in the watch hours to adjust the fire or bring a warm drink, spiced wine or posset, to ease their master's return to sleep. In cities where light spilled from the occasional candle in a window, the watch between first and second sleep could be more social. Some would visit neighbours, slipping quietly through alleyways to share food or simply company. Certain illicit activities, too, found cover in the midnight hours. But for many, this time was inward, a chance to think, pray, or simply lie still, listening to the quiet breathing of loved ones. In that valley village, the night was deep now. The wind outside pressed gently against the shutters. A child stirred in her sleep, and her mother, half awake, pulled the blanket closer around her small shoulders. Somewhere in the dark, a rooster, confused perhaps, crowed once, then fell silent. Beyond the walls, the river kept flowing as it always had, under the watch of the moon that had just begun to climb above the hills. This pattern of two sleeps would endure for centuries, shaping the rhythm of medieval life as much as the ringing of the church bell or the tolling of the market hour. It was a time when night was both feared and cherished, a season for dreams and quiet labours alike. But as we will see, not every sleeper lay still through the night, and not every bed was meant for rest. Some habits were stranger still, rituals, charms, and even foods meant to shape the nature of one's dreams. And on this night, long ago, as the village settled once more into its softer second slumber, there were already stories stirring in the minds of those who would wake with the dawn, ready to share the curious visions they had seen between the two sleeps. The pale light of early morning had not yet touched the hills, and the valley was still swaddled in darkness. In one of the smaller cottages, the low embers of the hearth glowed like a bank of red eyes, casting faint warmth into the sleeping room. A woman stirred beneath a rough wool blanket, the weight of sleep still clinging to her. She had just awoken from a dream, one of those strange visions that came in the deep part of the second sleep, when the mind seemed less tethered to the waking world. In her dream, she had been walking through a field that stretched forever, its grass heavy with dew, yet each blade shimmered as though made from glass. She had heard bells far away. To her, this was no idle fancy. Dreams were messages, and the bells might mean a journey was coming. She lay still for a while, thinking on it, before the first stirrings of the household began. In the medieval world, morning did not always break with haste. The rhythm of waking was as much about light as it was about the hour. Without the sharp insistence of an alarm, people rose with the pale creeping of dawn, or in winter, sometimes later. But those whose lives depended on the care of animals were often up before the sun. Cows had to be milked, horses fed, and the first chores begun. Still, many peasants had already experienced hours of wakefulness during the night, and so the second waking could feel gentle, as though it was the last step of a longer ritual. Inside the manor houses, the wealthy might remain in bed while servants moved quietly about, stoking fires and bringing warm water for washing. Beds in these households were elaborate affairs, with thick wooden frames, embroidered curtains, and carved headboards. Yet even these luxuries could not fully keep out the chill of an unheated stone room. This was why the medieval nightdress, whether a simple linen shift or a heavier woolen garment, was a necessity. For some, caps or hoods were worn to bed to keep warmth from escaping. The wealthiest households sometimes perfumed their bed linens with dried lavender or rosemary, not only for fragrance but because certain herbs were thought to guard against evil spirits during the night. The belief that darkness was a time when unseen forces walked freely was deeply rooted. In towns, people might cross themselves before sleeping, murmur a prayer to their patron saint, or place an object, a small cross, a relic, or even a knife, near the bed for protection. In rural villages, charms of woven straw or bundles of herbs were tucked under pillows or hung by the door. The boundary between dream and waking was porous, and the unseen world was thought to slip through it with ease. A nightmare was more than an unpleasant vision. It could be a visitation, a warning, or even the sign of a curse. And so, the act of preparing for sleep was not just about comfort, it was also a kind of quiet defense. Many households followed routines before first sleep that helped set the stage for the night. Meals were often taken early in the evening, as eating too heavily before bed was thought to bring disturbing dreams. Yet certain foods were considered helpful for rest: a warm broth, a drink of milk, or for the wealthier, spiced wine or mulled ale. Recipes for such drinks often included honey, cinnamon, and nutmeg, not only for flavor but because these spices were believed to warm the body and soothe the humors. The medieval understanding of health was deeply tied to the balance of these humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and sleep was thought to be a way of keeping them in harmony. In the monasteries, the structure of the night remained rigid. Even after returning from the midnight prayers of matins, monks were expected to rise again at lauds just before dawn. Their sleep was short, and yet their lives were long by medieval standards, perhaps because of the strict order that governed their days. The quiet between the two sleeps offered them time for reading sacred texts, meditating, or simply sitting in the stillness, listening to the faint creaks of the building and the distant hoot of an owl. For peasants, that midnight waking could also be practical. Winter nights were long and fuel was precious. Families might wake to adjust the fire, pushing logs deeper into the embers to keep them alive until morning. In some cases, this watchful period became the best time to share private thoughts. The children, sleeping in a warm tangle, would not hear the low-voiced discussions about debts, planting plans, or the health of livestock. Neighbours, too, might use the cover of darkness to knock quietly on a friend's door for help or counsel. The dark was not just for rest. It was a time when words could be spoken without the day's eyes upon you. The sleeping arrangements themselves could be a reflection of status and circumstance. In the cramped rooms of poorer households, the entire family might share a single bed, with the youngest children pressed in the middle for warmth. In some places, even guests would be welcomed into the shared bed without scandal. The idea of personal sleeping space was far less rigid than it would later become. In wealthier homes, guest beds were still common, but they were prepared with care: straw freshly turned, linens aired, and sometimes warmed with heated stones or pans of coals. When people spoke of sleep, they often did so with the weight of tradition and superstition. A person who could not sleep might be said to be under the influence of witchcraft, or suffering from an imbalance that required a physician's attention. Remedies ranged from the spiritual, prayers, blessings, charms, to the herbal. Infusions of chamomile, valerian, or poppy were used, sometimes in dangerous strength. For children, lullabies were sung not merely to soothe, but to protect, with lyrics invoking saints or angels to keep watch through the night. The night was not always peaceful. Dogs might bark at shadows, and travellers passing along the road could stir unease. Wolves still roamed some regions, and in the worst winters, they drew close to human settlements. The sound of howling could ripple through a sleeping village like a shiver, pulling people from their dreams into wakefulness. In towns, the watchmen called the hours, but they also raised alarms when fire broke out or when suspicious strangers were seen. Sleep was precious, but it was never entirely safe. As the second sleep began to fade and the earliest light brushed the world, the valley's roofs were still rimmed with frost. A cart creaked somewhere on the road beyond the fields. The river's song was clearer now, a reminder that day was coming, and with it the steady pull of work. But for a few more breaths, those still wrapped in wool and linen clung to the last fragile moments of rest, knowing that the night, with all its quiet rituals and hidden life, would come again soon enough. In the heart of winter, when the days were short and the nights seemed to stretch endlessly, the pattern of sleep became even more pronounced. The first sleep, long and deep, felt like a descent into a vast cavern of quiet. The waking in between, sometimes lasting an hour, sometimes more, became a familiar companion to the dark months. People learned to fill it not with restless tossing, but with small, deliberate acts that bridged the two halves of the night. It was in this midnight interval that much of the subtle life of the medieval household unfolded. In the manor on the hill above the village, a great hearth fire burned low, its flames hidden in the belly of glowing logs. The lady of the house lay in her curtained bed, the fabric heavy enough to keep out draughts, though the air beyond it still carried the bite of frost. She had been roused by a dream. She had seen a hawk land upon the windowsill, clutching something white in its talons. She did not know whether this was an omen of good fortune or of trouble, but she would remember to tell her confessor in the morning. Beside her, a small bell rested on a stool. She rang it softly, and a servant emerged from the shadows, carrying a candle. A warm cup of posset was placed in her hands, the steam rising into the cold air. She drank slowly, thinking of her dream, the candlelight glinting on the rings that still adorned her fingers in sleep. Down in the village, the waking hours were quieter, but no less purposeful. In one cottage, a man sat near the embers, sharpening a small knife. He worked slowly, the rasp of metal faint in the stillness, and from time to time he rose to check the latch on the door. His wife, seated on a low stool, mended a tear in their eldest son's shirt. They spoke little. The night did not invite chatter. Outside, frost stiffened the grass, and the stars shone cold and bright, undimmed by any light from the homes. Not all midnight hours were spent indoors. Some men, particularly in farming families, used this time to tend to animals that needed care at odd hours, newborn lambs that had come early, or cows close to calving. In winter, a sudden frost could kill the youngest or weakest livestock, so a vigilant eye was worth the sacrifice of unbroken sleep. Lantern in hand, they moved through the barns, their breath visible in the cold, the straw crunching beneath their boots. The animals stirred at their approach, their warm bodies steaming faintly in the lamplight. In towns and small cities, the watch between sleeps could be livelier. Bakers often rose in these hours, kneading dough in the warmth of their ovens so that bread would be ready by morning. The smell of rising loaves sometimes drifted into the streets, mingling with the smoke from banked hearths. The night watchmen made their rounds, staffs in hand, lanterns swinging, calling out the hours in low, measured voices. 2 o'clock and all's well. Occasionally they would stop to warm themselves at a friendly doorway or to speak briefly with a baker or guard before continuing their patrol. The learned few, monks, priests, and the occasional wealthy merchant, sometimes used the waking hours for reading or writing. By candlelight, bent over thick parchment, they traced the slow curves of their letters, the ink shining wet before it dried to a deep brown. The sound of a quill scratching was one of the few noises in the stillness, and the air smelled faintly of wax and ink. For these men, the night offered uninterrupted thought, free from the demands and interruptions of the day. There were also those for whom the night was a time of quiet transgression. Lovers met in these hours, slipping from their beds and crossing frost-hardened fields to rendezvous in barns or behind stone walls. Secrets were exchanged here, and sometimes promises, though the darkness kept its own counsel. The night gave such moments a strange intimacy, a closeness shaped as much by the shared risk as by affection. For many, the first sleep was the heavier of the two, carrying away the aches of the day's labour. The second sleep, beginning after the waking, was often lighter and filled with vivid dreams. It was in these hours that visions came most clearly, images of faraway places, of loved ones long gone, or of strange creatures never seen in daylight. These dreams were discussed in the morning with serious faces, and sometimes they were taken to a priest or a wise woman for interpretation. A dream could be a blessing or a warning, and it was dangerous to ignore either. Dream books circulated among the literate, offering interpretations of common visions. To dream of clear water was often considered a sign of peace. To dream of cloudy or turbulent water, a sign of trouble. To dream of a hawk, as the lady of the manor had, could mean power or conflict, depending on the bird's behaviour. Though such books were rare outside of monasteries and wealthy homes, their interpretations often filtered down to the common folk through word of mouth, reshaped and embroidered with each telling. In the cottages, the second sleep often began with the family drawing closer under the covers, conserving warmth against the coldest hours of the night. The youngest children would sometimes wake, whispering to a parent or sibling about a dream before settling back into slumber. The fire might be left to die at last, its heat spent, for dawn was not far off. Outside, frost rimed the edges of every thatch and fence post, and the sky began to pale in the east, When morning finally arrived, it brought with it the slow unwinding of the household from sleep. In the manor, servants would enter the bedchamber quietly, bringing basins of water and laying out clothing. In the village, the family rose to rekindle the fire, break their fast with bread or porridge, and begin the long cycle of work again. But in the quiet between those two sleeps, they had inhabited a different world, a private one, where firelight, whispered words, and the slow beat of their own hearts were the only measures of time. Snow lay deep along the edges of the valley, muffling every sound except the faint rush of the river beneath its ice-crusted banks. The nights in such a season felt endless, and people spoke of them with both weariness and gratitude. Long winter darkness meant more hours by the hearth, more time for stories and small crafts, and more of those midnight wakings that had shaped the habits of generations. In the hush of those hours, when the first sleep had loosened the body and the mind drifted half in the realm of dreams, the night seemed to breathe differently. In a narrow timbered house near the market square of a small town, a family's bedchamber occupied a loft above their shop. The parents and two children slept in a single bed, the frame built low and strong, with a mattress of straw sewn into thick linen. Beneath them, in the shop below, the scents of dried goods, grains, onions, salted fish, lingered even through the night. Around midnight, the father stirred. It was a habit now, the way his eyes opened without thinking. He rose, stepping carefully over the tangle of limbs and blankets, and lit a small taper. In the dim light, he checked the shutters against the wind, then sat for a time near the embers in the small hearth, sipping a little warm ale that had been left from supper. In villages and towns alike, the midnight watch was also the hour when some men returned from journeys or labour done far from home. Carters who had travelled late to reach the safety of the gates might arrive under the watchman's eye, their breath clouding in the cold. Inns would open their doors to such travellers, offering a space by the fire or a place in a shared bed for a few coins. The mingling of strangers in the deep night often brought news, rumours of markets, wars, or distant weather, and these stories were carried on to others in the days that followed. Within monasteries, winter nights brought a different kind of stillness. The cloister walls, rimmed with frost, seemed to contain a silence that pressed inward. When the bell for matins sounded, the monks moved in single file to the chapel, their shadows swaying across the flagstones in the light of a few guttering candles. The service was short in the bitter cold, but after the prayers, some lingered in the library or scriptorium. Wrapped in their heavy habits, they bent over manuscripts, their breath misting the air as they traced careful letters with chilled fingers. Outside, the wind moved through the cloister garden, rattling the bare branches. In rural households, the waking between sleeps was often spent in small, necessary work. A woman might card wool by the dim firelight, her hands moving slowly, the soft fibres catching what little warmth there was. A man might repair a harness strap or carve a wooden peg. For some, these hours offered time to think about debts, harvests, marriages, or the health of kin. In the dark, thoughts came differently, sharpened by quiet and distance from the day's noise. There were beliefs that certain times in the night were more dangerous than others. Between midnight and cockcrow was thought by some to be the hour when spirits, both benevolent and ill, could pass most easily into the mortal world. Those who woke then sometimes prayed aloud or crossed themselves before moving from their beds. If a dog began to bark at nothing, or if the wind seemed to carry a strange voice, such moments could chill more than the air itself. In villages, charms were hung near the bed, small bags of salt, bits of iron, or even a pair of shoes turned upside down to confuse wandering spirits. Among the wealthy, the midnight waking could be a time for indulgence. Servants were sometimes kept ready to bring food or drink at their lord's request. A warm spiced drink, a slice of sweetened bread, or even roasted chestnuts might be served to the bedchamber. Some nobles used this time for private conversations away from the ears of the household, or for reading romances and histories by candlelight. The flicker of the flames on carved bedposts, the rustle of fine linen, and the low murmur of voices created an intimacy the day could not match. In the countryside, the stillness between sleeps was not absolute. The winter wind rattled shutters and whistled through the chinks in walls. From the barns came the occasional sound of an animal shifting in its sleep, or the low, steady chewing of a cow. A fox might cry out in the distance, or the snow might creak beneath the paws of something unseen. Those who ventured outside with lantern in hand moved slowly, the light falling in small circles on the frozen ground. The second sleep, when it came, often began with a sense of surrender. After the brief waking, bodies sank back into warmth, eyes closing to the pull of dreams. In this softer, lighter sleep, visions often on sharper detail, faces of those long dead, landscapes both familiar and strange, events that seemed half prophecy, half memory. Dreams were part of the language of the night, and their meaning was not easily dismissed. By the time the first grey light touched the snow, the two halves of sleep had woven together into the night's full measure of rest. Fires were stirred back to life, bread was sliced, and water was brought in from the well. The day began again, and though the work would be long and the cold unyielding, there was comfort in knowing that the long night would return, with its firelit hours and slow, secret rhythms, waiting just beyond the fall of dusk. The days lengthened slowly as winter began its quiet retreat, yet the old rhythm of two sleeps still clung to the households of town and countryside alike. The shift in light was subtle at first, a little more brightness in the sky when the first waking came, a sense that the second sleep might be shorter now. In those early days of spring, when the frost still lingered at dawn, but the air smelled faintly of thawing earth, people moved through the night with the same measured habits they had carried through the darker months. In a stone house belonging to a prosperous merchant near the river's bend, the first waking came just after midnight. He opened his eyes to the faint sound of the current beyond the shutters. His wife slept beside him, one hand curled loosely against her cheek, and the bed curtains stirred slightly with a draught from the window. He reached for the tinderbox at his side and struck a flame, lighting a small lamp. The glow revealed the glint of polished wooden chests, the folds of neatly hung garments, and the silver cup he had left on the table before retiring. Pouring himself a little watered wine, he sipped slowly, thinking of the trade journey he planned for summer. In these hours, without the press of the day's demands, such thoughts seemed to arrange themselves more clearly. Far away, in a village at the edge of a wide plain, the midnight waking was a quieter thing. A mother, half dreaming still, heard her youngest stir in the darkness. She reached over, tucking the blanket more tightly around the small body, and listened to the child's breathing deepen again. Outside, a faint breeze moved through the thatch, carrying the distant sound of an owl's low call. Her husband was already awake, sitting near the hearth with a short strip of leather in his hands, rubbing beeswax into it to soften it for a harness. The smell of the wax mingled with the faint, dry scent of last summer's straw beneath their bed. The watch between sleeps was often used for prayer, but prayer could take many forms. In the countryside, some murmured familiar psalms, while others simply sat in the glow of the embers, turning over in their minds the tasks of the coming day. In towns, those with books might read a few lines from the Gospels or a favourite saint's life, tracing the letters with their finger in the unsteady light. Such reading was slow work. The script was dense and the margins narrow, and sometimes a single page could hold the attention for many nights. It was also in these hours that some chose to tend to personal matters best kept from daylight. A merchant might quietly count coins, ensuring that no eyes but his own knew the weight of his purse. A housewife might check on a small store of dried herbs, measuring out what could be spared to help a neighbour's ailing child. In the subtle privacy of the night, decisions could be made without the quick judgments that the morning sun sometimes brought. In the great houses of nobility, the waking was often attended by servants who moved with soft steps across rush-strewn floors. If the master or mistress desired, a brazier could be brought closer to the bed for warmth, or a hot drink prepared in the kitchens below. Some lords held whispered conversations with their stewards at this time, making arrangements for the next day's visitors or discussing letters received from distant allies. In certain courts, it was even fashionable to entertain select guests in the middle of the night, serving light food and wine in chambers lit with beeswax candles. For others, the waking was a chance to leave the bed entirely. In rural areas, men sometimes stepped outside to check the night sky, reading the weather in the position of clouds or the brightness of the stars. Women might go to the loft to check on stored grain, making sure it was safe from damp or mice. The stillness of the night sharpened the senses. Every creak, every distant step, every animal's low murmur seemed to carry farther. The superstitions that clung to these hours were not easily cast aside. It was said that if one looked into a mirror between midnight and cockcrow, they might see more than their own reflection, perhaps the face of one soon to die, or a spirit that had followed them from a dream. Some feared the whistle of the wind at the eaves, believing it could be the breath of wandering souls. And so, certain families kept charms beneath their pillows, a sprig of rosemary, a twist of red thread, or a small iron nail to ward off ill fortune. Dreams continued to play their quiet part in these nights. The lighter second sleep was a fertile ground for visions, and in this season of shifting weather, people paid attention to what they saw. A dream of blossoming trees was taken as a sign of good harvest. A dream of a house without a roof, a warning of illness or loss. Though many did not read or write, they carried a rich vocabulary of dream symbols, handed down through families like a well-worn tool. By the time dawn approached, the second sleep left most feeling rested enough to rise with the sun. The merchant by the river's bend would blow out his lamp, drawing his wife closer as they drifted into that lighter slumber. In the village on the plain, the father would hang the softened leather strip by the door, knowing it would be ready for the day's work. And when the pale light finally reached their windows, they would rise to find the fire coaxed back to life. The air scented faintly of smoke and fresh morning chill. The memory of the night still lingering in the corners of their minds, like a quiet, secret world. The spring deepened, and the darkness of night softened in its hold. The first waking now came when the moon had climbed high above the rooftops, and the second sleep was shorter, almost reluctant to begin. Yet still, the pattern endured, as if it had been woven into the bones of the people themselves. In the narrow streets of a market town, the air at night carried the mingled scents of baking bread, damp stone, and the faint tang of the river's edge. The quiet was never perfect here. There was always a cough from a neighbouring house, the tread of a watchman, or the creak of wood as buildings settled into the cool. In one modest home above a weaver's shop, the family had gone to bed early, their bodies tired from a long day at the loom. Shortly after midnight, the father awoke first. The moonlight filtering through the shutters made a faint silver pattern on the wall. He lay still for a moment, listening to the slow breathing of his wife beside him and the occasional shift of their children in the trundle bed at their feet. Rising carefully, he reached for the small oil lamp on the shelf and lit it. The glow revealed the threads still stretched on the loom below, ready for work when daylight returned. For a while he sat by the small table, twisting together lengths of spare yarn into a cord, his thoughts wandering to the market day ahead. Across the street, a midwife sat awake during the same hours, not because of habit, but because she had been called to attend a labour that began in the first part of the night. The narrow room where she worked was warm from the fire, though outside the chill still lingered. She moved with quiet assurance, her hands skilled from years of such work. These night births were common. No one chose the hour when a child came, and it was said that those born between midnight and dawn carried a particular strength of spirit. By the time the second sleep was beginning in most households, a new voice had entered the world, wailing its first protest to the dimly lit room. In the countryside, the watch between sleeps could still bring people outdoors. Shepherds, who slept in huts near their flocks during lambing season, often spent the waking hours tending fires to keep predators at bay. Wolves were less bold than in the deep winter, but foxes and stray dogs still prowled. The shepherd's lantern light moved slowly across the pasture, casting long shadows on the damp grass. Sometimes, when the sky was clear, they would pause to look up at the stars, naming them in low voices, using them to reckon the hour. The wealthy also clung to their own night customs. In a manor on the edge of the forest, the lord had taken to reading in the watch hours. A small chest beside his bed held several precious volumes, parchment pages bound in leather, their script dark and dense. He would sit propped against cushions, a servant bringing him warmed wine as he turned each page. In these hours, the household was silent, save for the crackle of the hearth and the faint rustle of the parchment. Sometimes he read alone. Other nights he had his steward or chaplain read aloud, the words falling into the quiet like stones into deep water. Among common folk, the midnight waking was a time when certain remedies were prepared. Herbs gathered in the previous summer were steeped into teas, meant to ease the coughs and fevers that lingered into spring. It was believed that medicines brewed during the night, especially between the two sleeps, carried a stronger virtue, as if the silence itself could lend strength to the cure. Mothers would sit by the fire, stirring a small pot, the steam rising to curl in the dim air, before setting the drink aside for morning. Dreams, too, were still spoken of with care. With the season's change came new symbols to watch for. Green fields in a dream could mean abundance, but if those fields were empty of people or animals, it might be a sign of loneliness to come. Birds were important too. Swallows brought good fortune, while crows might be warnings. Those who dreamed vividly in the second sleep often shared their visions at breakfast, and sometimes neighbours would be called to hear and offer their interpretations. The superstitions around the watch hours did not fade with the season. Even in spring, it was thought wise not to speak certain names aloud in the dark, for fear they might be heard by more than human ears. In some places, people still avoided whistling at night, lest it invite wandering spirits. Small children were sometimes told that if they woke in the middle of the night, they must stay in bed until called, or risk being taken by the night air, a phrase whose meaning was never fully explained, but which was enough to keep them still. When the second sleep finally came, it carried a different quality in these warmer nights. The air was softer, scented faintly with damp earth and the first blossoms of the hedgerows. Windows might be left open a little for fresh air, allowing the quiet hum of insects to mingle with the breathing of the household. By dawn, the dreams had begun to fade, replaced by the first stirrings of the day, footsteps in the street below, the clang of a pail at the well, the faint, steady beat of work beginning again. And as always, the memory of those silent, secret hours between sleeps would remain, tucked away like a private possession until the night returned. By early summer, the nights had grown shorter, and the two-sleep rhythm began to compress into something lighter, though it did not disappear entirely. In the long days, when the sun lingered above the horizon well into the evening, people often went to bed later, yet still found themselves waking in the quiet middle hours. The air was warmer now, carrying the scent of hayfields and the faint sweetness of blooming herbs, and in open windows, night breezes stirred the edges of bed curtains. In the village by the slow-moving river, the first waking came to many just after the moon had begun its descent. Doors creaked open as some slipped outside, drawn by the cooler air. In one cottage, a young couple sat in the dim light, their child asleep between them on a folded blanket. They whispered about the work of the coming day, she about the spinning she must finish before the next market, he about the repairs to the fishing nets. In the half-dark, their words felt different, unhurried, their voices softened by the hour. Across the meadow, a farmer left his bed entirely during the waking. He had seen lightning on the horizon before going to sleep and wanted to check the clouds. Carrying a lantern, he walked the edge of his fields, the soil still warm beneath his bare feet. The frogs in the nearby marsh sang in loud, uneven chorus, and in the distance he heard the low mutter of thunder. Satisfied that the storm would not arrive until after dawn, he returned to the low, timbered house, where his wife had just stoked the fire back to a glow. In the towns, summer's waking hours could be livelier than in winter. The night watch still patrolled the streets, but they now passed groups of men and women returning from late gatherings. Alehouses stayed open longer in the warm months, and sometimes music drifted through open shutters long after midnight. In the smaller houses above shops, families might spend part of the waking at their windows, watching the street below, speaking in low tones so as not to wake the children. The wealthy often made the most of these warm nights. In some manors, the lord or lady would walk the garden paths during the waking, accompanied by a servant with a lantern. The moonlit hedges and scent of night-blooming flowers turned the grounds into a place of quiet beauty. Occasionally, guests staying at the manor were invited to share in these walks, discussing matters of business or gossip in voices meant to be lost to the crickets. Superstitions shifted with the season, but they never vanished. It was said that the warm air made certain spirits restless, that they could travel farther from their usual haunts in the summer months. For this reason, some households still placed protective charms near the bed, though now it might be sprigs of lavender or bundles of thyme, herbs both fragrant and, in belief, warding. In fishing villages, nets were sometimes hung near doorways, thought to trap ill fortune before it could enter. Dreams in the second sleep carried new meanings in summer. To dream of bees was seen as a sign of prosperity, especially if they were swarming peacefully. A dream of sudden rain could foretell a quarrel, while dreams of fire might be warnings to guard one's home and hearth. Those who believed strongly in such signs might change their plans for the day ahead based on what visions had come to them in those last hours of rest. In rural homes, the second sleep in summer was often lighter and less urgent. Some awoke before it ended, rising early to take advantage of the cool hours before the sun rose high. The sound of roosters and the rustle of leaves in the wind could rouse a household before the true light of morning. Others lingered in bed, letting the second sleep drift over them in soft waves, knowing that the work of haying or weeding would wait a little while longer. In the monastery by the sea, the summer waking had its own character. After matins, some monks would walk the cloister in bare feet, enjoying the warm stone beneath them. The sea breeze carried the smell of salt and faraway places, and the sound of the waves mingled with the low murmur of prayers. When they returned to their cells for the second sleep, the air was already touched with the faintest hint of dawn, and their dreams often held visions of water, ships, and distant shores. By the time the sun rose fully, the world was already stirring. Nets were spread to dry, market stalls began to open, and the smell of baking bread returned to the air. Yet, for those who had woken in the depth of night, walked under the moon, or whispered in the shadow of sleeping children, the day began with the memory of those softer hours still resting quietly in their thoughts, like a secret folded between 2 pages of the same book. By the height of summer, the boundary between night and day grew thin. The darkness lasted only a few hours, yet the old pattern of first and second sleep persisted, adapted to the short span between dusk and dawn. The first sleep was shorter now, often beginning late, for people lingered outdoors in the evening warmth, talking on doorsteps, tending gardens in the fading light, or walking the fields to check for storms brewing on the horizon. Still, when the moon reached its highest point, a certain hush would settle, and in that hush, the first waking quietly returned. In a riverside hamlet, the warm air carried the scent of water and wild mint. A fisherman rose during the watch, stepping outside barefoot, his skin still warm from sleep. The moonlight turned the ripples on the river into long, shifting bands of silver. He stood for a while, letting the sounds of the night seep into him, the soft slap of water against the hulls of moored boats, the hum of insects, the faint call of a bird somewhere upstream. His nets were already prepared for the morning, but he checked them again, running his hands over the coarse ropes, listening for the faint rasp they made in the still air. In a small town, the waking was more communal. A baker lit his ovens before the second sleep, the scent of rising dough drifting down the street. The watchmen, making their rounds, would sometimes pause at his doorway for a few words or a crust of bread hot from the oven's first batch. Children, restless in the heat, might wake and pad to their parents' bed, whispering about strange dreams or asking for a drink of water. In the low, shadowed rooms, such moments felt suspended outside the march of hours. In the countryside, the warmth drew some from their beds entirely during the waking. Farmers used the coolness before dawn to walk their fields, pulling the occasional weed or checking for signs of pests. The smell of cut hay clung to the air, and the dew on the grass soaked through their bare ankles. Some households brought work into these hours, shelling peas, repairing tools or plaiting straw, chores that could be done by lamplight without rousing the children. The nobility, too, took advantage of the summer watch. In certain great houses, shaded terraces and garden pavilions became gathering places in the middle of the night. Friends and relatives might be summoned quietly from their chambers to share fruit, wine, or cold meat under the stars. These hours allowed for conversations that would not have been possible in the public daylight. Alliances whispered over goblets, or plans for journeys and marriages discussed in the privacy of moonlight. Superstitions in this season often spoke of thresholds. The thinness of summer nights was said to make it easier for dreams to slip into the waking world. People were cautious about speaking aloud any ill-omened vision upon rising for the watch, lest they give it strength. Herbs thought to guard against such misfortunes were gathered fresh in summer, St. John's wort, mugwort, and vervain, and hung in doorways or kept under pillows. It was believed that the scent alone could scatter troubling dreams before they took root. Dreams themselves took on a more vivid quality in the second sleep of summer. The closeness of the air seemed to press images deeper into the mind. Fields burning under a red sky, flocks of birds wheeling endlessly overhead, or endless walks through sunlit meadows that never turned to dusk. Some woke from such visions with an uneasy heart, while others spoke of them as if they were gifts. The interpretation of these dreams was a skill claimed by certain elders in every village, and they were often visited in the days after a particularly strange vision. The watch in summer could also be a time of chance encounters. Travellers moving at night to avoid the heat of the day sometimes passed through villages in these hours, leading pack animals quietly along the road. A door might open to offer them water or a place to rest, though more cautious households watched silently from behind shutters. News, both good and bad, often arrived in the night this way. Rumours of poor harvests, of strange illnesses in distant towns, of markets overflowing or bare. As the second sleep began, the air outside often grew cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of morning. Birds sometimes began to stir earlier than the light, their calls filtering into the half-dreams of those still lying in bed. In these last hours, rest was lighter, the mind already leaning toward the work of the day. And when dawn finally broke in full, it did so quickly, spilling light across rooftops and fields, erasing the shadows of the night's private world until evening came again to weave them anew. By late summer, the air was thick with heat even after the sun had set, and the two-sleep rhythm took on a languid, unhurried quality. Windows and shutters were left wide open at night, inviting in whatever breeze might wander through. The sounds of crickets, distant dogs, and the occasional splash of a fish in a pond or river seeped into the edges of dreams. People still drifted into their first sleep, though it came later now, often after the night sky had already wheeled halfway toward morning. In a farming village surrounded by golden stubble fields, the first waking was marked by small stirrings, a cough in one house, the scrape of a chair in another. A man rose from his bed and stepped out into the warm darkness, his bare feet sinking into the dust of the yard. He went to the shed to fetch a jar of stored honey. His wife had been coughing earlier, and a spoonful might soothe her. Inside, she sat up, hair tangled, eyes half-lidded with sleep, and smiled faintly as he handed her the jar. No words passed between them, but in the quiet, the gesture was enough. In the market town a few miles away, the waking hours were more active. Merchants preparing for the next day's fair began setting aside goods in the dim back rooms of their shops. By lamplight, they checked scales, sorted coins, and tied bundles of cloth. The faint glow of their windows was visible in the narrow lanes, and now and then a watchman, making his round, would pause to exchange a few quiet words. Somewhere near the square, a fiddler played to himself, the tune too soft to travel far, but enough to stir the air with a hint of melody. In rural hamlets, the watch often brought people together in informal ways. Neighbours who had seen each other at dusk might meet again at a shared fence, leaning on the posts to speak of weather, crops, or the latest birth in the village. A jug of ale might pass between them, and the conversation would ebb and flow until the thought of the second sleep pulled them home again. The warm nights made people linger, as though they could stretch the time between waking and sleep, into something almost like a third life within the day. For the wealthier households, the waking hours of late summer could be a form of quiet entertainment. Lanterns were hung along balconies or in gardens, and servants moved softly with trays of cooled wine or sliced fruit. Some noble families played games on low tables, dice, chess, or board games brought from distant lands. The air, fragrant with roses and warm earth, seemed to slow the passage of time, making each candlelit moment feel suspended. Yet even in these softened nights, superstition still touched the waking. Farmers avoided speaking certain words while walking the fields between sleeps, fearing they might call down misfortune before harvest. In fishing communities, it was said that to whistle during the watch would drive the fish away for days. Children were warned not to look too long into the dark beyond the lamplight, lest they see something that should remain unseen. Dreams in the second sleep of late summer often carried the weight of the season's labours. People dreamed of heavy baskets filled to the brim, of long tables groaning under the weight of bread and meat, or of fields standing golden in the sun. Such visions were taken as signs of contentment and plenty. But dreams of empty barns, of sudden storms tearing through the fields, or of animals wandering away were spoken of with unease. In these last warm weeks before autumn, the fortunes of the coming months seemed to be whispered in the language of dreams. By the time the second sleep ended, the light of dawn often came quickly. In the village, roosters began calling almost in unison, their voices sharp in the heavy air. The first carts could be heard on the road, wheels crunching over dry earth, and smoke began to rise from hearths where bread was being set to bake. In towns, shutters opened to let in the morning air, and the streets slowly filled with footsteps. But for those who had passed through the watch in stillness, their thoughts lingered on the memory of the night. The honey shared in the dark, the soft sound of a fiddle, the taste of fruit beneath the stars, moments that would not be spoken of much, yet would stay quietly with them until summer's end. As summer began to wane, the nights grew a little cooler, and the weight of the day's heat no longer clung so stubbornly after sunset. The two-sleep rhythm seemed to stretch again, the darkness offering more room for the mind to wander in the watch between. The air now carried the scent of ripening fruit, of hay stored in barns, and the first faint trace of wood smoke from fires lit in the evening. In the low, timbered house of a miller by the stream, the first waking came when the mill's great wheel was silent, the current moving past it in a soft, steady rush. He rose from the bed he shared with his wife and padded to the open door, where the cool breeze touched his skin. The moonlight fell on the water, silvering the edges of the wheel. He checked the sluice gate, though there was no reason to. Habit had etched this movement into his nights. When he returned indoors, his wife was sitting up, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She had dreamed of a great bird flying low over the mill and wanted to tell him before it slipped from her mind. They spoke of it in low voices, each wondering if it was an omen, and then sat together by the hearth without lighting a flame, letting the darkness remain. In the nearby village, the waking hours were alive with quieter industry. A cooper, working by lamplight, shaped the curve of a barrel's stave with careful strokes, the shavings curling away from his blade. From time to time, he paused to listen to the night. The murmur of the stream in the distance, the creak of a roof beam settling, the faint sound of a neighbour's dog shifting in its sleep. In these hours, his hands knew the work well enough that his thoughts could drift, wandering to memories of past harvests and to the worry of how much grain would come in this year. For some, the watch was a time for preparation. A brewer might check the slow work of fermentation in the cool corner of his cellar. A shepherd might mend a strap or polish a bell for the flock. In the monastery outside town, the bell for muttons called the monks into the dark stone chapel, where the sound of chanting rose and fell like the tide. Afterward, some returned to their cells, while others walked the cloister in silence, savouring the night air before the second sleep claimed them again. The wealthier families began to feel the pull of autumn in these hours. Some took to sitting in covered galleries with blankets over their laps, sipping spiced wine while the wind carried the rustle of leaves from the orchard. The conversations turned more to plans for the winter. Supplies to lay in, repairs to be made before the cold, arrangements for the seasonal movement of goods. Servants moving quietly through these spaces sometimes overheard pieces of such talk, carrying the words back to the kitchens, where they joined the steady current of household rumour. Superstitions took on a sharper edge with the season's change. It was believed that as the nights lengthened, the boundary between the living and the dead grew thinner. The watch between sleeps was thought to be a moment when messages might pass more easily from one side to the other, whether through dreams or sudden waking visions. Some kept a candle burning low all night, not for light, but as a sign to wandering spirits that they were welcome to pass by without harm. Dreams in the second sleep seemed to grow heavier with meaning. A dream of gathering fruit was taken as a promise of good health, but one of rotting apples could be a warning of misfortune. Dreams of the mill wheel stopping were feared most of all in the village near the stream, for it was said to foretell a season of hunger. Those who dreamed such things often kept them to themselves, not wishing to give the vision more power by speaking it aloud. As the second sleep gave way to dawn, the cool air carried a new sharpness. In the miller's house, the sound of the sluice gate opening marked the return of the wheel's steady groan. In the village, shutters creaked open, and the smell of baking bread mingled with the faint smoke from the night's embers. The light spread slowly over the land, revealing baskets of apples waiting to be sorted, fields with their stubble turned silver in the dew, and the quiet faces of those who had passed through the night's secret hours, carrying them silently into the day ahead. By early autumn, the sun dipped earlier each day, and the two-sleep rhythm began to reassert itself more fully. Evenings grew cooler, urging families indoors sooner, and the weight of blankets returned to beds that had been left light through the summer. The first sleep now felt deeper, heavier, as though the body welcomed the longer nights after months of heat. And the waking between was no longer a languid, warm drifting. It was a crisp, clear interval, sharp-edged with the scent of turning leaves. In the valley, where the river wound like a ribbon of silver, the first waking came to many with the sound of wind stirring the apple trees in the dark. In one small cottage, a young boy rose with his father, the two moving quietly so as not to wake the others. The boy's eyes still held sleep, but he was learning the habit of this time, how to tend the fire without scattering embers, how to move about in the dark without knocking against the low table or the hanging herbs. They sat together for a while, sharing a heel of bread from the evening meal, the father pointing out the sound of an owl far off in the fields. These lessons, given in the watch hours, seemed to the boy like part of a secret inheritance. In the nearby market town, the waking was a moment for preparation. A seamstress lit her small oil lamp and bent over a half-finished garment, the needle glinting as it caught the light. The day ahead promised many customers, farmers' wives bringing in wool to be mended before winter, merchants requesting cloaks for their journeys. She preferred the stillness of the night for such work, when the streets outside were quiet and no one came knocking at the door. The only sound was the steady pull of the thread and the occasional shifting of the lamp's flame when the wind whispered through the shutter cracks. For the wealthy, autumn's waking brought a return to firelit chambers and heavier fare. In the manor above the town, the lord and his steward sat before a low table, its surface scattered with parchment. They spoke in hushed tones about the granaries, the state of the roads, and the coming harvest. In these hours, away from the eyes and ears of the household, such matters could be discussed more freely. Servants brought mulled wine, and the scent of cloves mingled with the faint smoke from the hearth. Superstitions about the watch hours deepened with the lengthening nights. It was said that in autumn, the spirits of the land began to move more freely, slipping between the living like wind through reeds. Farmers avoided whistling or singing when they rose between sleeps, for fear of drawing attention from something unseen. In some homes, bowls of milk were set out on the doorstep before the first sleep, a silent offering to whatever might pass by in the dark. Dreams during the second sleep of autumn were often bound up with the work of the season. People dreamed of heavy wagons groaning under the weight of grain, of orchards filled with ripe fruit, or of hands stained deep red from pressing apples. Such dreams were shared in the mornings as a measure of fortune, a quiet gauge of whether the winter ahead might be lean or generous. But there were darker visions too, fields lying bare, wells running dry, or snow falling endlessly before its time. Those dreams were less often spoken of, and when they were, it was with the seriousness of a warning. In the monastery, the matins bell cut through the stillness with a sharper tone in the autumn air. Monks wrapped in their heavy habits moved like shadows across the cloister, their breath visible as they entered the chapel. The chants rose slowly, their sound echoing against the stone, and when the service ended, some remained in silent prayer, while others walked the covered walks, looking out at the orchard where wind shook the last leaves from the branches. As the second sleep took hold once more, the night seemed to fold itself around the sleepers like a heavy cloak. In the cottage by the apple trees, the boy dreamed of walking through an endless field of grain taller than himself, the sky above him turning from gold to deep indigo. In the manor, the Lord's thoughts drifted into dreams of maps and distant roads, and when dawn finally reached the valley, it came with a pale, slanting light that touched the wet grass and the slow-moving river, while the memory of the watch hours lingered quietly in the hearts of those who had passed through them. By mid-autumn, the night had grown long enough that the watch between sleeps felt like an entire world of its own. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves, damp earth, and the faint tang of smoke from hearths burning oak and beech. Darkness came early, folding itself over fields and towns, and people welcomed the heavier blankets, the glow of lamps, and the comfort of warm food before bed. In a farmhouse at the edge of a sloping meadow, the first waking came with the creak of rafters in the cooling night. The husband rose first, drawing on a thick wool tunic, and went to check the storeroom. By lamplight he counted the sacks of barley, running his hand over the rough fabric as though to reassure himself of their presence. His wife joined him a little later, bringing a clay mug of hot milk steeped with a pinch of nutmeg. They spoke quietly about the weather, watching the shadows shift along the stone walls, knowing that the harvest, still waiting in the fields, would need to be brought in before the first frost. In the market town beyond the meadow, the waking hours were filled with softer sounds. A cobbler bent over his bench, shaping a new pair of boots for a customer who would need them before winter. The gentle tap of his hammer against the sole echoed faintly in the stillness, mingling with the muffled call of the watchman as he passed in the street below. Somewhere nearby, a cat padded across the roof tiles, its silhouette crossing the sliver of moonlight that slipped in through the open window. In the manor on the hill, the watch had its own rituals. The lady of the house often gathered her ladies-in-waiting in a small chamber lined with tapestries where a brazier glowed faintly in the corner. They read aloud from a collection of romances, each voice taking its turn in the pool of candlelight. The stories, with their knights, quests, and distant lands, drifted into the minds of the listeners until the line between waking and dreaming blurred. Sometimes, before returning to their beds, they would take a slow turn through the gallery, looking out at the darkened gardens where the wind moved through the hedges like an unseen hand. The superstitions of these hours deepened as the year turned toward its darker half. It was said that between first and second sleep, one might hear the whispers of those who had gone before, carried on the wind through the open shutters. Some believed that if you dreamed of someone who had died, it meant they were trying to send a message, and that waking in the watch was the best time to receive it. In some homes, a candle was kept burning through the night, not for light, but as a guide for any soul that might pass. Dreams in the second sleep of mid-autumn often took on an otherworldly cast. People dreamed of forests that stretched forever, their paths carpeted in red and gold leaves, of rivers running backwards, of fires that burned with no heat. These visions were brought to the morning meal in the form of quiet stories, each listener adding their own interpretation. Sometimes the dreams were taken as warnings, prompting small changes in the day's plans, a journey delayed, a tool repaired before use, an extra offering made at the church. In the countryside, the watch was also a time for preserving what the harvest had brought. Families would sit together by the fire, peeling apples for drying, their skins curling away in long, unbroken ribbons. Others stirred pots of jam, the sweet steam rising to fill the room, while jars clinked gently against one another on the table. The work was steady and unhurried, its rhythm matching the soft crackle of the hearth. In the monastery on the far side of the hill, the bell for matins rang out into the crisp air. The monks moved in silence, their sandals whispering over the flagstones, their faces pale in the light of a few high windows. After the service, some lingered in the cloister garden, where frost had begun to form on the grass, and the last roses drooped heavy on their stems. They breathed in the cold, knowing it would not be long before the earth would sleep under winter's hand. As the second sleep returned, it wrapped itself more thickly around those within its reach. The farmer dreamed of wagons rolling steadily toward full granaries, the cobbler of a road stretching endlessly into mist, the lady of the manor of a white stag moving silently through a moonlit wood. And when the first pale light of dawn touched the land, it found them ready for the day ahead, carrying the secret weight of the night's quiet labours and the strange, half-remembered visions that had come and gone between the two halves of their rest. By late autumn, the nights were long enough to feel like a season in themselves. The daylight hours shortened quickly, and the dark pressed close on both sides of the day. Frost lay heavy in the mornings, glistening on rooftops and stiffening the grass, and the smell of wood smoke clung to every garment. In these deep nights, the two-sleep rhythm took on its fullest form. First a descent into heavy, dreamless rest, then a waking that felt almost like entering another life, quiet and separate from the sunlit hours. In a small stone cottage at the edge of the forest, the first waking came to the sound of wind slipping between the eaves. The father rose, careful not to wake the younger children bundled together in a shared bed. He stirred the fire until it flared softly, casting light over the rushes on the floor. His wife joined him, drawing her shawl tighter as she brought out a small loaf from the cupboard. They cut it in silence, eating slowly while the wind tapped at the shutters. There was no rush, these hours were for stillness. In the village centre, a potter worked in the quiet between sleeps. The clay had been shaped earlier in the day, and now he moved among the shelves in his workshop, turning each piece slowly to check for flaws. The lamplight gleamed on the damp surfaces, and his hands moved with a care born from years of repetition. Now and then he glanced toward the small window, where the dark pressed against the glass as though listening. In the manor beyond the fields, the watch hours were devoted to quiet counsel. The lord sat with two of his men at a table near the fire, a map spread before them. They spoke in low voices of patrols, of the state of the outer walls, of travellers seen on the road. The fire cracked softly as their shadows stretched across the floor. Beyond the chamber, the rest of the household slept, unaware of the small decisions shaping their safety. Superstitions in late autumn were stronger than at any other time of year. It was said that the long nights allowed things to travel farther from their proper places, both in the waking world and in dreams. People avoided looking out of windows between first and second sleep, fearing they might see something in the dark that would follow them back inside. In some homes, bowls of grain were left on the hearth before bed, offerings meant to keep any wandering presence satisfied and harmless. Dreams in the second sleep seemed sharper, more vivid. People dreamed of paths vanishing under falling leaves, of fires that would not light, of strangers knocking on their doors. Others dreamed of abundance, tables laden with food, cellars brimming with wine, warm rooms filled with laughter. These dreams were often shared quietly the next day, compared against the changing weather or the behaviour of the animals, looking for patterns and signs. In the monastery, the matins bell rang like a cold coin dropped into a still pool. The monks gathered in the chapel, their chants filling the air with a slow, resonant rhythm. After prayers, some remained in meditation, while others walked the cloisters, their breath rising in the chill. The orchard beyond lay bare now, the branches black against the faint light of the moon, and the ground below was already hard with frost. In the countryside, families often used the watch to work on repairs before the deeper cold arrived. Leather harnesses were mended, tools sharpened, baskets patched. Children who woke in the middle of the night might be allowed to sit by the fire, threading dried berries onto string or turning the crank of a small grinder for spices. These small tasks, done in the half-light, seemed to settle into memory differently, as if the night gave them a separate weight from the work of the day. As the second sleep returned, it came like a heavy cloak pulled over the shoulders. The forest cottage grew still again, the wind outside a steady whisper. The potter dreamed of a kiln that burned without fuel, the lord of walls that stood unbroken against the snow, the monks of a single bright star in a black sky. And when dawn came, pale, slow, and edged with frost, it found the land washed in a thin gold light, the smoke from morning fires rising straight into the cold air, and the quiet knowledge that the longest nights were still ahead. By the first weeks of winter, the nights had swallowed much of the day. The sun's light was pale and brief, leaving long stretches of darkness on either side, and the air outside carried a stillness so deep that even the smallest sounds seemed to linger. The two-sleep rhythm reached its fullest form now, an unhurried passage from the first deep rest through the watch and back again into the softer second sleep before dawn. In a snow-dusted hamlet near the frozen bend of a river, the first waking came with the faint crack of ice shifting in the current. Inside one low-roofed cottage, the father rose from the bed he shared with his wife and eldest son. He pulled on his heavy cloak, lit a stub of candle, and went to check the woodpile stacked against the wall. The fire would burn steadily through the night, only if fed just enough to keep the embers alive until morning. His wife joined him, carrying a small bundle of kindling to add to the flames. They sat for a time on low stools, hands curled around mugs of hot broth, speaking little. In the village centre, a blacksmith was awake as well, not at his forge, but in the small workroom behind it. The heat of the day's fire had long faded, and the air was sharp and cold. He sat sharpening a set of chisels by lamplight, the steady rasp of metal against stone the only sound. Occasionally he paused to flex his fingers, the joints stiff with the cold, before setting back to work. The night outside seemed to press against the shuttered window, but inside the small circle of light there was nothing but the quiet rhythm of his task. Up on the hill, the manor's watch was a more elaborate affair. The great hall's hearth burned low, casting a warm glow over the carved beams. The lord sat at a table with his chaplain, reviewing letters brought by a messenger earlier that evening, news of markets, disputes over land, the movement of winter goods. The faint smell of resin from the burning logs mingled with the scent of beeswax candles. Outside, the snow whispered down over the courtyard, softening every edge. Superstitions at this time of year were sharper still. The watch between sleeps was said to be a time when the world was thinnest, and some believed that to sleep through it entirely was to risk missing warnings meant for the living. In certain households, one member would deliberately remain awake during the watch, keeping an eye on the hearth and listening for signs, unusual noises, changes in the wind, the behaviour of animals in their stalls. In some homes, this was seen as a duty as important as tending the fire. Dreams in the second sleep of early winter often felt heavy, weighted with symbols that people took seriously. A dream of footprints appearing in fresh snow could mean an unexpected visitor. A dream of a frozen river might foretell delays or obstacles, and dreams of warm, sunlit rooms filled with familiar voices were cherished as signs of safety through the cold months. The next day, such visions would be discussed over bread and porridge, the interpretations woven into the fabric of village talk. In the monastery beyond the frozen fields, the matins bell rang into the darkness with a hollow clarity. The monks walked through cloisters lined with frost, their sandals leaving pale prints on the stones. Inside the chapel, the air was so cold that the candle flames bent with the smallest breath of movement. The chants rose slowly, as if gathering warmth from their own sound, and when the service ended, the brothers dispersed, some to read in the dim light, others to sit in silence until it was time to return to bed. In rural homes, the watch was also a time for mending and making. Wool garments were patched, boots resoled, and nets repaired for use when the ice began to break. Some households used the hours to work on small gifts for the midwinter feast, wooden toys for children, embroidered cloths, or candles dipped slowly into warm tallow. The smell of these labours filled the rooms, mingling with the faint sweetness of dried fruit stored for the holiday. When the second sleep came, it did so with the heavy embrace of deep winter. Outside, the snow fell without sound, layering over roofs and hedgerows. In the cottage by the river bend, the father dreamed of ice giving way to flowing water. The blacksmith dreamed of a forge blazing bright against the cold. The lord dreamed of a distant summer road stretching away under a clear sky. And when dawn finally came, it was pale and slow, spilling over a land hushed under its white covering, the smoke of morning fires rising in steady columns into the cold air. By midwinter, the nights were so long that the waking between sleeps often felt like a small day folded into the darkness. The first sleep was deep, pulling the body down with a weight born of cold and weariness. When the waking came, it arrived not with haste, but with the slow stir of people returning to themselves, listening to the creak of beams and the low sigh of wind against the walls. In a thatched farmhouse set back from the frozen road, the father was first to rise. He pulled a cloak around his shoulders and stepped into the main room, where the hearth's embers glowed faintly under a blanket of ash. He took up the poker, stirring until thin threads of flame emerged, and added a few pieces of wood. His wife soon joined him, wrapping her hands around a small clay cup filled with warm ale sweetened with honey. They sat close to the fire, the silence broken only by the faint pop of sap in the wood. This was the hour when they often spoke of what repairs must be done before spring, their voices low enough not to wake the sleeping children. In the village centre, a carpenter worked quietly in his shed, shaping a beam for a roof that had sagged under the weight of early snows. The lamplight spilled in a narrow band through the door, catching the fine sawdust drifting in the air. Outside, the world lay still, save for the occasional call of the night watchman making his rounds. Inside, the steady rhythm of his plane against the wood carried the calm assurance of work done without hurry. In the manor's upper chamber, the waking was filled with softer comforts. The lady of the house sat in a cushioned chair by the fire, a heavy shawl across her knees, while one of her attendants read aloud from a leather-bound book. The words, "Stories of distant lands and ancient kings," filled the chamber in a low, steady cadence. Occasionally she would pause the reading to ask about the health of a tenant or to give small instructions for the following day. Beyond the curtained windows, snow fell steadily, the moonlight turning the courtyard into a pale, silent expanse. Superstitions in the depth of winter were thick with caution. It was believed that the long dark gave freer passage to wandering spirits, and the watch between sleeps was the time they most often drew near. In some homes, small bowls of grain or milk were placed near the hearth before the first sleep, left untouched until morning as a quiet offering. Children were warned not to look too long into the dark beyond the lamplight, lest they see something that might follow them into their dreams. Dreams in the second sleep were vivid in these cold months. People dreamed of walking across endless snowfields, of doors that opened into warm firelit rooms, of feasts in great halls where the air smelled of bread and roasted meat. Such dreams were often seen as signs, comforting if the rooms were bright, troubling if the doors remained shut. In the morning, these visions were shared over porridge or bread, with neighbours sometimes called in to hear and weigh their meaning. In the monastery across the river, the matins bell rang with a deep, steady tone, echoing off the frozen water. The monks moved through the cloister in single file, their breath clouding in the air. Inside the chapel, the candles cast a thin light over the stone walls, and the chants rose slowly, each note lingering before it faded into the cold. After prayers, the brothers returned to their cells, some stopping to warm their hands at the brazier before lying down for the second sleep. For many, the watch was also a time for making and mending. In the farmhouse, woolen socks were darned, harness straps repaired, and the edges of tools sharpened against spring work. Some households used the hours for small celebrations, sharing dried fruit, nuts, or a sip of preserved wine, as if to remind themselves that warmth and abundance would return. In the manor, the cook might prepare a spiced drink to be carried up to the Lord's chamber, its steam curling into the cold air as it crossed the stone hallways. When the second sleep came, it came deeply, wrapping each household in its heavy quiet. Outside, the snow lay unbroken across road and field. The only movement, the drifting flakes that blurred the outlines of trees and walls. In the farmhouse, the father dreamed of green shoots pushing through thawed earth. The carpenter dreamed of sunlight on a finished roof. The lady of the manor dreamed of riding under clear skies. And when the pale morning light returned, it found the world still hushed, every breath of the waking day clouded with frost. By the last stretch of winter, the nights felt unending, though the faintest promise of change lingered in the air. The sun still lingered low in the sky, but each day brought a few more heartbeats of light, just enough for people to notice. Until then, the darkness still ruled, and the two-sleep rhythm shaped the life of every household. The waking between was as familiar as the warmth of the hearth, and in its quiet hours, the world seemed to belong entirely to those who kept it. In a cottage tucked against a hillside, the first waking came with the soft rattle of frost loosening from the thatch. The husband rose, pulling on his boots, and stepped outside into the biting air. Above him, the stars burned sharp and bright, the kind of cold clarity that made the night sky feel endless. He checked the latch on the shed and listened for the low, steady breathing of the animals within. From somewhere far off came the faint bark of a fox. When he returned indoors, the fire was already coaxed back to life by his wife, who had set a small pot of oats to warm for anyone who woke before the second sleep. In the village's lone inn, the watch hours were busier. A small group of travellers, delayed by snow on the northern road, sat huddled around the hearth, speaking in low tones. The innkeeper moved between them and the back room, refilling mugs of ale and setting out rough bread. Outside, the wind carried snow across the courtyard in slow, swirling drifts. A pair of horses shifted in the stable, their breath visible in the light spilling from the half-open door. The quiet of the night was broken now and then by the laughter of a man telling a story, his voice softened by the thick air of the room. In the manor's library, the lord sat alone during the waking, reading by the light of 2 tall candles. The shelves loomed in shadow, their rows of leather-bound volumes standing silent. He traced a finger down the page, occasionally pausing to make a note in the margin. Beyond the tall windows, the snow reflected the moonlight so strongly that the night seemed to glow. At his feet, a greyhound slept, shifting only when the logs in the hearth cracked too loudly. The watch in this late winter carried heavier superstitions than in other months. It was believed that certain dreams seen in the second sleep were omens for the entire year ahead. A dream of a house filling with water could foretell floods in spring. One of birds flying indoors was said to warn of sickness. Some people left small charms under their pillows before the first sleep, hoping to invite good visions. Others avoided eating after supper, believing that a heavy stomach could cloud the truth of a dream. In the monastery on the far slope, the Martin's bell cut through the stillness like a thread of iron. The monks gathered in the chapel, their voices joining in slow chant that echoed in the high vaults. After prayers, some returned to their beds, but a few lingered in the scriptorium, the scratch of their quills a faint counterpoint to the distant wind. From a small window, one could see the courtyard cloaked in white, the fountain at its centre frozen into a sculpture of ice. In rural homes, the watch hours were spent on work that could be done quietly and close to the fire. Women carded wool, the fibres floating in the warm air, while men carved handles for tools or patched harness leather. Children, if awake, were sometimes given tasks, sorting dried beans into bowls or stringing wooden beads to make toys. These small labours had a rhythm that seemed suited to the time, unhurried and content to exist in the glow of the hearth. When the second sleep came, it was deep, but not without dreams. The hillside farmer dreamed of standing on thawed ground, watching green buds swell on the trees. The innkeeper dreamed of a road clear of snow, the sound of carts and travellers returning. The lord dreamed of an unbroken summer sky. Outside, the frost thickened on every branch and beam, and the stars burned until the horizon began to pale. Morning would come slowly, with its muted gold light spilling over the snowbound roofs, but until then, the world lay wrapped in the hushed weight of winter's longest hours. By the first days of early spring, the grip of winter had begun to loosen, though its shadow still lingered in the long nights. The snow melted unevenly, leaving pale patches across the fields and along the edges of roofs. The air was damp now, carrying the smell of thawing earth and wet bark, and the nights held a softer kind of quiet than they had in the months before. The two-sleep rhythm still held its place, but there was a lightness in the watch between sleeps, as though the season itself was beginning to stir from its own slumber. In a cottage at the bend of a muddy lane, the first waking came with the drip of water from the eaves. The father rose, pulling on his boots, and stepped out to see the stream swollen with meltwater. The moonlight caught on its restless surface, turning it into a ribbon of pale silver. He checked the wooden boards laid across the path to the barn, adjusting one that had been shifted by the thaw. Inside, his wife sat near the fire, warming her hands around a clay cup of chamomile tea, a habit she had taken to in these colder months. She asked after the stream, and he answered with a small nod before sitting beside her in the quiet. In the village, the watch hours found a cooper awake in his shop. Spring meant barrels would be in demand again, for ale, for salted fish, for the first greens brought to market. He worked by the glow of a single oil lamp, the light sliding over the curved staves laid out before him. Each stroke of his tool was deliberate, the sound soft against the stillness of the street outside. Through the open gap in the shutter he could hear the faint rush of the river beyond the houses. At the manor, the waking was filled with the smell of wax and parchment. The steward sat with the lady of the house, reading aloud letters that had arrived before nightfall. Some were from merchants speaking of the first trade routes opening after winter. Others were from distant kin, carrying news of births, marriages, and illnesses. The lady listened closely, sometimes asking a question, sometimes sitting silent for long moments before speaking again. In the stillness, the words seemed to hang in the air longer than they might in daylight. The season's change brought its own superstitions to the watch. It was said that in early spring, the dreams of the second sleep could show glimpses of the year ahead in ways winter dreams could not. A vision of flowers blooming out of season was taken as a sign of strange weather. One of a bird singing indoors was said to promise unexpected visitors. Some households placed a small sprig of green near the bed before sleeping, hoping to invite dreams of abundance. Others burned a pinch of dried herbs in the hearth during the watch to drive away any lingering winter spirits. In the monastery, the matins bell rang softer than in the coldest months, the sound less sharp in the damp air. The monks walked the cloister with their hoods drawn low, the stone beneath their feet darkened by moisture. In the chapel, the candles burned with a steady flame, the chants echoing gently against the walls. After prayers, a few lingered in the garden, where small shoots had begun to push through the earth, pale but persistent against the lingering chill. In rural homes, the watch was often a time for planning. Men spoke of repairing fences, clearing ditches, and planting early seeds. Women discussed what remained in the storeroom and what could be spared for neighbours whose supplies had run thin over winter. Sometimes these talks were brief, spoken over the soft crackle of the fire. Other times they stretched until the second sleep claimed them again. When the second sleep came, it brought with it dreams that seemed to carry the scent of wet earth and the sound of running water. The laneside farmer dreamed of planting rows of beans under a sky streaked with swallows. The cooper dreamed of barrels lined in neat rows, their wood warm in the sun. The lady of the manor dreamed of walking through a meadow where the grass bent gently under her hand. And when morning came, it did so with a cool mist and the sound of the river's song, an early promise that the world was slowly waking. By mid-spring, the nights had shortened enough that the watch between sleeps seemed to pass more quickly, yet it still held its quiet importance. The air had lost the bite of winter, carrying instead the smell of damp soil and green shoots. Frogs sang in the ditches, and the wind moved softly through budding branches. People still rose between sleeps out of habit, but the darkness no longer felt as deep, and the quiet seemed gentler, touched by the nearness of morning. In a cottage near the edge of a ploughed field, the first waking came to the sound of rain tapping lightly on the shutters. The farmer rose, pushing the blanket aside, and stepped to the doorway. The air was fresh and cool, filled with the scent of wet earth. He stood for a moment, listening to the rhythm of the rain before turning back inside. His wife was already at the hearth, stirring a small pot of barley broth. They sat together, speaking in low voices about the early planting and whether the rain would linger past dawn. In the market town, the watch found a weaver awake in his loft above the shop. The half-finished cloth on the loom caught the lamplight, its threads gleaming faintly in the dim. He worked with slow precision, the shuttle moving back and forth in steady rhythm. Outside, the rain made the cobblestones shine, and the only sound beyond the loom was the occasional drip from an overhanging roof. In these hours, he could think more clearly than during the bustle of day, planning patterns for future work. At the manor, the watch brought the sound of quiet music. In a small chamber off the great hall, the young daughter of the household sat at a small harp, plucking strings softly so as not to wake those sleeping nearby. Her mother listened from a cushioned seat, eyes half closed, the firelight flickering across her face. When the girl paused, they spoke briefly about the guests expected later in the week, their words mingling with the lingering notes in the air. Beyond the windows, the rain traced faint patterns down the glass. Superstitions in spring's watch hours often centered on growth and change. It was said that if you dreamed of planting seeds in the second sleep, your household would prosper. Dreams of heavy clouds were thought to warn of delays in work, while dreams of birds feeding young were taken as signs of good news to come. Some families placed bowls of fresh water near their beds before sleeping, believing it would draw dreams of clarity and renewal. Others left shutters slightly open during the watch to let in the night air, convinced it carried health into the house. In the monastery near the river, the matin's bell was softer now, its echo dulled by the damp. The monks walked through the cloister garden on their way to the chapel, the paths lined with young shoots pushing through the soil. The chants in the chapel carried a warmer tone, and after prayers, some brothers lingered to tend the herbs planted in sheltered corners, brushing rainwater from the leaves. In rural homes, the watch was used for quiet preparation. Tools were checked and sharpened, seed sacks were mended, and rope was coiled neatly for the work ahead. Children who woke were sometimes allowed to sit near the fire, shelling peas or helping to patch a tear in a tunic. The tasks were small, but felt like part of the slow turning of the year toward abundance. When the second sleep came, it was lighter now, touched by the nearness of morning. The farmer dreamed of furrows stretching under a warm sun, the weaver of cloth rich in colour and texture, the manor's young harpist of a meadow filled with music. And when dawn arrived, the rain had thinned to a mist, the air smelling clean and new, as if the night itself had been part of the season's quiet work of renewal. By late spring, the days had grown so long that darkness felt more like a pause than a rule. The watch between sleeps was shorter now, but it still carried its own shape, quieter than day, gentler than winter, filled with small movements and murmured words. The air was warmer, drifting in through open shutters with the scent of flowers from gardens and wild hedgerows. Even the night sounds had changed. The soft rustle of leaves, the steady hum of crickets, the distant splash of fish leaping in the river. In a cottage at the edge of a broad meadow, the first waking came just after midnight. The father rose without lighting a lamp, moving to the open door where the moon poured silver light across the grass. He could see the faint shapes of hares feeding along the hedgerow and hear the soft stir of cattle shifting in the pasture. Behind him, his wife sat on the bed's edge, braiding a length of cord she had been working on for weeks. They spoke briefly about the haying that would begin soon, their words unhurried in the quiet air. In the village, a baker was already awake, though not yet at his ovens. He sat at the long wooden table in his shop, kneading dough for the morning loaves. The smell of yeast hung faintly in the room, mingling with the cooler air drifting in through the high windows. Outside, the street lay still except for the passing of the night watchman, his slow footfalls marking the hour. The baker worked steadily, his hands moving by habit, knowing the second sleep would be short and the day ahead long. At the manor, the waking was marked by open windows and the distant call of a nightingale. The lord sat with his steward at a small table, reviewing plans for the week's markets and the delivery of goods from nearby estates. The fire in the hearth was small, more for light than warmth, and the candles flickered in the soft breeze. Every so often, their talk would pause as both men turned to listen to the birdsong outside, a sound rare in the stillness of winter nights, but now common enough to seem like a herald of the coming summer. Superstitions in the late spring watch often centered on the turning of the seasons. It was said that dreams of flowing water in the second sleep promised a smooth and prosperous summer, while dreams of fire might warn of storms to come. Some households placed fresh-cut flowers near the bed before the first sleep, believing their scent would bring good dreams and keep ill omens away. Others preferred to keep their windows open, letting the night's mild air flow through the house to carry away any lingering shadows of winter. In the monastery near the meadow, the matins bell rang softly through the warm darkness. The monks walked to the chapel with lighter steps now, their robes brushing the stone in a steady rhythm. After prayers, some chose to sit in the cloister, listening to the layered sounds of insects and the faint trickle of the fountain. A few tended the garden even at this hour, pulling weeds by touch and planting herbs that thrived in the gentler air. For farmers, the watch was often a time for sharpening scythes, checking the wooden teeth of rakes, and sorting seed for late planting. In some homes, families worked together at the table, mending fishing nets, twisting ropes, or grinding grain for the next day's bread. These tasks were done in easy silence, the only sound the soft hiss of the hearth or the creak of a stool as someone shifted their weight. When the second sleep returned, it was lighter than in winter, touched with the knowledge that dawn would come soon. The meadow farmer dreamed of a sky full of swallows, the baker of baskets of bread cooling in the morning sun, the lord of a long ride through fields bright with wildflowers. And when morning came, it spilled into the world quickly, washing over the rooftops and flooding through the open shutters, carrying with it the warm promise of summer. By early summer, the nights had become brief and gentle, their darkness more a soft veil than a deep shroud. The two-sleep rhythm still persisted in some homes, though it had thinned into a lighter form. First rest, followed by a waking so short and easy it sometimes felt like drifting on the edge of a dream. Then a second sleep that often blended seamlessly into dawn. The watch in these months was a quieter, more languid thing, carrying with it the scent of warm grass and the faint hum of life beyond the walls. In a cottage shaded by an old oak, the first waking came to the sound of leaves stirring in a faint breeze. The father rose, stepping barefoot to the open doorway. The meadow beyond glowed under the moon, pale blossoms scattered like stars across the grass. Somewhere in the dark, a nightjar called, its song blending with the soft rush of wind through the hedges. Behind him, his wife lit a single candle and sat at the small table, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. They spoke quietly about the market day ahead, their words unhurried, their hands moving without need for thought. In the fishing village by the coast, the watch hours were rarely still. A small group of men prepared their boats for the morning tide, checking ropes and nets in the dim lantern light. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, and the water in the harbour shifted gently against the hulls. From a nearby cottage window, a woman watched them, her spindle turning slowly in her hands, the thread coiling soft and even in her lap. The light from her hearth spilled faintly onto the stones outside, mingling with the glow of the harbour lamps. At the manor, the waking was a time for open shutters and the cool touch of night air. The lady of the house sat at a writing desk, composing a letter to her sister in another shire. A single lamp lit the page, and the scratching of the quill was the only sound. Beyond the window, the gardens lay silvered in moonlight, their paths empty, but for the occasional flicker of a moth. When she finished, she left the letter on the table for the morning's courier and stood a moment by the open casement, breathing in the mingled scents of roses and warm stone. Superstitions in early summer's watch were gentler than in the darker months. It was said that if a dream in the second sleep showed a clear sky, the summer would be kind. If clouds gathered in the vision, storms would follow. Some placed bowls of fresh water by their beds, believing that the reflection of the moon upon it would draw peaceful dreams. Others left a sprig of mint or thyme near the pillow, trusting the scent to ward off any restless spirits of the night. In the monastery on the hill above the fields, The matins bell rang softly, its sound drifting into the warm darkness. The monks walked to the chapel with bare feet on cool flagstones, the air around them carrying the faint sweetness of blooming flowers. After prayers, some lingered in the garden, where the moonlight lay across the herb beds, and the bees' hives stood silent under their thatched roofs. In farmsteads, the watch was often used for light work that needed no daylight, tying bundles of herbs to dry in the rafters, mending light fishing tackle, or checking the coops for any disturbance. Children sometimes woke and wandered into the main room, curling against a parent on a bench and listening to the quiet rustle of work until sleep pulled them back. The second sleep of summer came gently, as if carried on the same breeze that moved the leaves outside. The oak-shaded farmer dreamed of a hayfield golden in the sun, the fisher of a calm sea rich with shoals, the lady of the manor of a garden where flowers never faded. And when the morning came, it arrived swiftly and brightly, spilling gold across the land, washing away the shadows of night, and leaving only the soft memory of those still and secret hours between the two halves of rest.